The Sea Witch's Revenge. The moon hung low over the restless waves, casting an eerie glow on the weathered deck of the Crimson Gull. Captain Edgar Vane stood at the helm, his sharp features illuminated by the faint light of the lantern swaying in the night breeze. His crew whispered nervously among themselves, their eyes darting toward the edge of the ship where the sea shimmered unnaturally. They had been adrift for weeks, their holds empty of loot and their morale as low as the tide. Desperation had driven Edgar to seek the aid of the Sea Witch, a being feared in every port from the Eastern Isles to the frozen north. Stories of her vengeance were as vast as the ocean itself, and few who sought her aid ever lived to tell the tale. "Captain, are you sure about this?" First Mate Langley asked, his voice trembling as he approached Edgar. "The Sea Witch isn't the sort you bargain with lightly." Edgar's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the railing. "I don't need your warnings, Langley. This ship is falling apart, and so is the crew. If the witch can help us find treasure, then we'll take the risk." Before Langley could argue further, the waters around the ship began to glow, a sickly green light that sent shivers through the crew. The wind died, and unnatural silence fell over the sea. Then, without warning, a figure rose from the depths. The Sea Witch was both beautiful and grotesque. Her body shimmered with scales that glinted in the moonlight. Her hair flowed like seaweed caught in the current, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly green. Her lips curved into a knowing smile as she floated just above the surface of the water. "Captain Edgar Vane," she purred, her voice both melodic and menacing. "You seek my aid." Edgar swallowed hard, steeling himself. "I do." The witch's eyes narrowed, her smile widening to reveal sharp, pearlescent teeth. "I can grant you what you desire, riches beyond measure, glory that will echo across the seas. But everything has a price, Captain." "What kind of price?" Edgar demanded, though his voice faltered. The Sea Witch laughed, a sound like crashing waves. "That depends on the scale of your ambition. Tell me, what do you want?" Edgar straightened, his resolve hardening. "I want a fortune so vast that my name will be remembered for generations. I want my crew to follow me without question, my enemies to cower at the sight of my sails." The witch's eyes gleamed. "Ambitious. Very well, Captain. I will guide you to a treasure that will fulfill your wildest dreams. In return, you must promise me your most prized possession." Edgar hesitated, his mind racing. What was his most prized possession? His ship? His crew? His freedom? None of these seemed worth more than the fortune she promised. "Fine," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "You have my word." The witch's smile grew darker, her hands weaving intricate patterns in the air. The sea around the Crimson Gull roiled, and the green light grew brighter. A map appeared on the surface of the water, glowing with golden lines that formed a route through treacherous waters to an uncharted island. "Follow this path, Captain," the witch said. "But beware, for the treasure comes with trials. Prove yourself worthy, and it will be yours." With that, the witch sank back into the sea, her laughter echoing as the green light faded. The waves resumed their natural rhythm, but the crew remained frozen in silence. Langley was the first to speak. "Captain, whatever you promised her, you'll regret it." Edgar ignored him, his eyes fixed on the fading glow of the map. The promise of riches was too tantalizing to resist, and the price, whatever it was, seemed a distant concern. "Set sail, men," he barked. "We have a treasure to claim." The Crimson Gull followed the path laid out by the Sea Witch, navigating treacherous waters and surviving storms that seemed to rise out of nowhere. The crew's spirits lifted as they neared their destination, the promise of untold wealth fueling their determination. But Edgar couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The witch's final words echoed in his mind, and he began to wonder what he had truly agreed to. As the silhouette of the island appeared on the horizon, Edgar pushed his doubts aside. Whatever trials awaited them, he was determined to succeed. The Crimson Gull anchored just off the shore of the mysterious island, its silhouette dark against the silver wave. Thick mist clung to the coastline, shrouding the dense jungle and the jagged rocks that surrounded it. Captain Edgar Vane stood at the prow, his hands gripping the railing as he stared into the swirling fog. "This is it," Edgar said, his voice low but steady. "The treasure is here." First Mate Langley approached, his face etched with doubt. "It doesn't feel right, Captain. That fog, it's unnatural." Edgar turned to him, his eyes blazing with determination. It's not your place to feel right or wrong, Langley. It's your place to follow orders. Ready the landing party. Langley hesitated but nodded, signaling to the crew. Soon, a small group of men armed with cutlasses and pistols lowered a rowboat into the water. Edgar was the first to climb aboard, his boots splashing as he steadied himself. As they approached the shore, the mist seemed to part for them, revealing a narrow path that wound through the jungle. The air grew heavy with the scent of salt and decay, and the crew exchanged uneasy glances. "Stay close," Edgar commanded, stepping onto the sand. The crunch of their boots was the only sound as they followed the path, their weapons drawn and their eyes scanning the shadows. The jungle was alive with strange noises, whispers carried on the wind, the rustle of unseen creatures, and the occasional crack of branches high above. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the island itself was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. At last, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a stone altar, weathered by time and covered in intricate carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light. Upon the altar rested a chest, its surface encrusted with jewels that sparkled like captured stars. "That's it," Edgar whispered, stepping forward. His crew hung back, their fear palpable. Langley reached out to grab his arm. "Captain, wait. We don't know what's guarding it." Edgar shook him off, his gaze fixed on the chest. "That's why I made the deal, Langley. The witch promised me this treasure. It's mine." With cautious steps, he approached the altar. The glow from the carvings intensified, and the whispers in the air grew louder. Edgar hesitated for a moment, then reached out and opened the chest. Inside was a hoard of gold and gems that defied imagination. The coins gleamed with an otherworldly luster, and the jewels radiated colors Edgar had never seen before. He could feel the wealth of empires beneath his fingertips. A triumphant grin spread across his face. "It's real," he breathed. "We've done it." But his victory was short-lived. The glow from the altar shifted, turning an ominous shade of red. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. Langley grabbed Edgar's arm again, this time with desperation. "We need to go now." Before Edgar could respond, the air around them erupted in a violent gust of wind. The fog swirled and coalesced into a figure. The Sea Witch. Her form was even more imposing than before, her scales glinting in the unnatural light and her glowing eyes fixed on Edgar with cold amusement. "You have taken the treasure," she said, her voice echoing through the clearing. "Now it is time to fulfill your end of the bargain." Edgar's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? I've done everything you asked." The witch's smile widened, revealing sharp teeth. "Did you think I would simply hand over such riches for nothing? You promised me your most prized possession." Edgar stumbled back, shaking his head. "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" The witch raised a clawed hand and a ghostly image appeared before them. It was Edgar, standing at the helm of the Crimson Gull, his crew cheering as they set sail. It was a moment of pure triumph, a moment he had always cherished. "Your most prized possession," the witch said, her voice dripping with malice. "Your freedom, your command of the seas." Edgar's heart sank. No, that wasn't the deal. The witch's laughter rang out, a chilling sound that sent shivers through the crew. "Oh, but it was, and now you will serve me." Before Edgar could react, the witch raised both hands and the clearing erupted in chaos. Vines shot up from the ground, wrapping around the crew and dragging them toward the altar. Edgar tried to fight, but the vines were too strong, their grip like iron. The witch floated closer, her gaze locking onto Edgar. "You sought glory, Captain, and now you will have it, for all eternity, as my servant." Edgar struggled against the vines, his mind racing. He had been outsmarted, his ambition used against him, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "This wasn't what I wanted." The witch leaned in, her glowing eyes boring into his soul. "Then you should have chosen more wisely." The last thing Edgar saw before darkness consumed him was the witch's twisted smile. The world seemed to collapse around Edgar as the vines tightened their grip, dragging him toward the glowing altar. The treasure he had coveted spilled from the chest, coins and jewels clinking against the stone. Around him, his crew thrashed and screamed, their weapons useless against the relentless tendrils of magic. "Enough!" Edgar roared, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I'll fight you, witch!" The sea witch's laughter filled the clearing, her translucent form shimmering with cruel amusement. "Fight me, Captain. Do you think your mortal strength can stand against the ocean itself? You made a deal, and now you pay the price." As the vines pulled him closer to the altar, Edgar's mind raced. He had spent his life outmaneuvering enemies, escaping traps, and gambling with fate, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. The witch's power was vast, and her presence felt like the weight of the sea pressing down on him. Yet, deep within, the fire of his defiance refused to die. "Release my crew," he spat, his voice sharp and commanding. They had no part in the deal. The witch's glowing eyes narrowed, her amusement giving way to something colder. "A noble request, Captain, but what are you willing to sacrifice for them?" Edgar hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been willing to risk everything for treasure, but now his greed had ensnared not just him, but those who had trusted him. He glanced at Langley, who was struggling to free himself, his face a mix of fear and anger. "Captain!" Langley shouted. "Don't do this. She'll take everything." Edgar clenched his jaw. He knew the witch's price would be high, perhaps higher than he could bear, but he also knew he couldn't abandon his men. He had brought them here, lured by promises of wealth and glory. Their lives were on his conscience. The sea witch floated closer, her voice softer now but no less menacing. "You may save them, Captain. All it takes is a simple choice. Surrender yourself to me, and they will be free." Edgar's heart pounded. He could feel the vines slackening slightly as if waiting for his answer. His gaze fell to the treasure spilling across the altar, the cause of all this chaos, and he felt a wave of shame. It had blinded him, driven him to make a deal he didn't understand. And now, it threatened to cost him everything. I agree," Edgar said, his voice barely a whisper. He straightened, forcing strength into his words. "Take me. Let them go." The witch tilted her head, her smile returning. "A brave decision, Captain, but bravery will not save you." She raised her arms and the vines released the crew, dropping them to the ground. Langley scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Captain, no! We can fight this! Go, Langley!" Edgar barked, his tone brooking no argument. "Get the men back to the ship. That's an order." The crew hesitated, their loyalty warring with their fear. Finally, Langley nodded, gathering the men and leading them toward the path. They glanced back, their expressions heavy with guilt, but they did as they were told. As the last of them disappeared into the jungle, the witch turned her full attention to Edgar. "You are mine now, Captain." The air grew colder, and the altar began to glow with a deep crimson light. Edgar braced himself as the witch's magic wrapped around him, lifting him off the ground. Pain coursed through his body, but he refused to cry out. If this was his punishment, he would face it with the defiance that had defined his life. "You will serve me for eternity," the witch intoned, her voice echoing like a storm. "Your soul bound to the sea, your will no longer your own." Edgar felt himself changing. His skin grew cold and damp, his breath shallow. The world around him blurred as the witch's magic consumed him. Images flashed through his mind, storms, shipwrecks, endless waves, and he realized what he was becoming. A guardian, a servant of the sea, a warning to all who would dare challenge the witch's power. When Edgar opened his eyes, the jungle was gone. He stood at the edge of the sea, the waves lapping at his feet. His body felt strange, stronger, but no longer entirely human. He looked down and saw scales glinting in the moonlight, his hands webbed and clawed. He turned and saw the crimson gull in the distance, its sails catching the wind as it disappeared into the horizon. Langley had kept his promise to leave, but Edgar couldn't shake the feeling of loss as he watched his ship, the last piece of his mortal life, slip away. "Do you understand now?" The witch's voice came from the waves, her form rising beside him. "This is your fate. You will protect my waters, ensure that no others disturb the balance." Edgar met her gaze, his eyes glowing faintly with the same green light as hers. "You may have taken my freedom," he said, his voice deeper, more resonant, "but I will never serve you willingly." The witch's laughter echoed across the sea. Serve or resist, it matters not. You belong to me now, Captain Edgar Vane. As the witch disappeared into the waves, Edgar turned toward the open ocean. The currents whispered to him, carrying the voices of sailors and the distant cries of gulls. He clenched his clawed fists, his resolve hardening. He would not be a mindless servant. If he was to be bound to the sea, he would find a way to turn his curse into defiance, and perhaps one day he would break free. The moonlight danced on the waves as Edgar waded into the water, his figure fading into the vast eternal sea.